What in the hell's diversity?
Well, I could be wrong, but I believe diversity is an old wooden ship that was used during the Civil War era.
Ron, I would be surprised if the affiliates were concerned about the lack of an old wooden ship, but nice try.
Hello, welcome to the first ever patrons-only episode of Blocked and Reported. I'm Jesse Single.
I'm Katie Herzog.
And this is this is pretty crazy that we're doing this. It's a little bit looser. I'm actually drinking a beer. Katie, before we started, Katie told me she was going to try smoking crack for the first time.
It just seemed like today seemed like the time right before the podcast. So far, so good.
You seem even more alert than usual. I will say that.
You know what? It's a little stronger than coffee. I will say that. Yeah.
Thank you so much for subscribing. There was this article that really jumped out at me this week. It was on NBC News. Headline: Current and ex-employees allege Google drastically rolled back diversity and inclusion programs. It's by a writer named April Glazer, and it basically just tells the story about how, as the headline suggests, Google is rolling back these diversity and inclusion initiatives. So it's one of these articles where the sourcing is strange. It's a lot of employees and ex-employees who supposedly have knowledge. And the storyline, they say, is that Google was worried it would sort of get caught up, be seen as anti-conservative, maybe to the point where it would cause them legal trouble. And that's why they shut down these trainings. Google sort of disagrees with that. A lot of the debate centers around a, quote, well-liked diversity training program at Google called Sojourn, a comprehensive racial justice program created for employees to learn about implicit bias and how to navigate conversations about race and inequality. This program was cut entirely. People are pissed about that. I just thought this was such a rich story because, first of all, don't you find it interesting that people expect their employer to give them, not just the basics, of how to treat your coworkers decently and not be biased in how you hire people, but, comprehensive racial education?
Yes, the employer should definitely be responsible for teaching ethics classes as well. Yeah. Yeah, this article was it was very clear to see where the author's sympathies lie in this particular piece, which is a little bit weird for sort of what should be kind of a straightforward news piece. But yeah, I mean, the claim is that Google shut down this program because they don't want to appear anti-conservative. So I remember after the Damore thing, Breitbart covered that. But the conservatives that I know, who I have to say, mostly I've met through Twitter and maybe are not representative of actual conservatives in the world. I think if you ask them what they would want from Google, what they would say is, I want Google to be a place where conservatives are welcome, not a place that doesn't value diversity, but a place that values diversity of thought as well as, diversity of race or whatever, income or whatever. I mean, and that also, the article didn't at all go into the research on implicit bias training, but as you have documented, implicit bias training is there hasn't been a lot of research to show that it's actually effective in reducing implicit bias. There has been some evidence that it is counterproductive. Do you remember when there was that big dust up after a Starbucks in Philly called the cops on some black customers?
Yep.
And then so Starbucks shut down all of their stores and across the country to have this implicit bias training. And I don't actually remember what the implicit bias training in that case consisted of. But at the time, I got in touch with Tony Greenwald, who was the creator of the implicit association test and who was a professor at the University of Washington. And I said, well, what do you think about this of Starbucks using, your training, your test in particular, to address implicit bias? So he wrote back and he said, this is a quote from an email that he sent me: Starbucks would be wise to check out the scientific evidence on implicit bias training. It appears to be the right thing to do, but this training has not been shown to be effective and can even be counterproductive. It will appear that Starbucks is doing the right thing, but the training is not likely to change anything. The implicit association test is a valuable educational device to allow people to discover their own implicit bias. However, taking the IAT to discover one's own implicit bias does nothing to remove or reduce those implicit bias. Desire to act free of implicit bias is not sufficient to enable action free of implicit bias. So what he's basically saying is that this test that he developed in particular won't do shit in terms of actually addressing implicit bias.
Yeah.
But tons and tons of organizations use this.
Well, actually, so part of that quote is in my book, and I mentioned you in my chapter on the implicit association test, because I think he's even overstating the claim that it accurately measures your bias. It really, it barely seems to measure anything, and this is where I think conservatives are actually pretty good at at gaming their refs and complaining a lot. I mean, you want to talk about victimhood culture; they have a lot of it too.
Absolutely.
I think here they sort of have a point with some of this stuff. Like when they say some of these diversity trainings, the way I interpret their argument is that they're really just smuggling in liberal political values. And so last year I wrote up like one of the only really well constructed evaluations of a diversity training program. I'll link in our notes for this, but it was this prominent team of social psychologists. If you're a nerd, these are household names: Catherine Milkman, Angela Duckworth, Adam Grant. And the only like real sign of effectiveness they found was what they called attitudinal support for women. So they asked people how much they agreed with statements like discrimination against women is no longer a problem, and society has reached the point where women and men have equal opportunities for achievement. But that's really just measuring how liberal people are. If the goal is to make people have more liberal attitudes, if a manager treats men and women the same and doesn't believe discrimination against women is no longer a problem, I don't really think it's the place of his employer to say, I demand you have better opinions on this subject.
Right, absolutely. And there have been a lot of cases where people, like after the James Damore memo blew up, and for anybody who doesn't remember that, James Damore was a Google employee who basically argued that he released like a memo on an internal message where it's basically arguing that the reason that there aren't more women in tech is because women are more interested in people, men are more interested in ideas. So he was arguing that it wasn't, bias and oppression that was responsible for the overrepresentation of males in this industry. It's just sort of like choice. So there was a professor at the University of Washington in the computer science program named Stuart Regis. And Stuart, he had taught computer science for 30 years, and he's sort of a heterodox thinker, and he's bold, and he basically gives no fucks about what people think about him, it seems like. And so Stuart wrote a piece about this for Quillette, saying that in his experience after 30 years of teaching intro to computer science, this sort of checks out, right? And he'd been given like teaching awards for like mentoring women in tech. Like he's also gay. I don't know if that actually means anything in this case, but he was not sort of the like cishet white male sort of stereotypical sexist, and he was a good teacher who thinks that the women he thinks that like of all of the, you can only do so much to bring women into this field, and then at some point there's just going to be sort of a natural roof there. And so Stuart wrote about this for Quillette, and of course there's a huge blow up in his department. And at some point, like I was actually one of the last stories I was working on for The Stranger was about this, and I had filed all these public records requests to find out the internal dialogue about Stuart and his piece, which unfortunately has been postponed due to pandemic. I hope to get these records at some point. But so at some point, Stuart's students, or students who some of whom were his and some of whom weren't his, had a problem with his piece, and so they basically wanted to get him fired. And he wasn't tenured. He's an instructor. He wasn't tenured at the school. So there are all of these documents sort of floating around offline, petitions and stuff like that, of these students trying to get Stuart fired. And there's these students had collected sort of testimonials from, and one of Stuart's students, she'd been in like an intro to computer science class. So she's responding to his claim that women are naturally less interested in tech than men. And so in this testimonial, she says that one of the things that made his class a hostile environment was that he used a metaphor around Star Trek. And she said this, as a woman, I am not interested in Star Trek. So just like the layer upon layer of like irony here of like, you're saying that you're not interested in Star Trek because you're a woman, while also arguing that the reason that there aren't more women in tech can only be because of some sort of systemic oppression. She also said something in this testimonial about how using this metaphor about Star Trek also privileged people who grew up with a television in their household.
Yeah, it's it was the discourse around the Damore memo was, I've had a couple moments where I just realized like how fucked progressive journalism is. Progressive journalism continues to do certain things quite well, but the Covington story, which I've written about, we don't need to go into now, and this story where I disagreed with the Damore memo. It was not like the misogynist equivalent of Mein Kampf. If you actually read it, and if you were a little bit familiar with the sex differences literature, which I was, and if you don't, it was like sort of a conservative, slightly distorted evolutionary psychology gloss on some actual research. And I'll link to this article too, but Cordelia Fine, who's a professor of psychology at the University of Melbourne and a crusader for feminism and women's rights, in The Guardian, she said that his summary of the differences between the sexes was, quote, more accurate and nuanced than what you sometimes find in the popular literature. She also said that his ideas were, quote, very familiar for me as part of my day-to-day research and are not seen as especially controversial. So there was something quite extraordinary about someone losing their job for putting forward a view that is part of the scientific debate. And then to be so publicly shamed as well, I feel pretty sorry for him. If Cordelia Fine doesn't think that this was like a nightmarishly bigoted memo, it probably isn't it. And I just noticed the way it's like all these stories, tell me if this was the sense you got. It was like all these different media outlets first decided that it was important to show how much they hated the memo and then to shape all their reporting and commentary around that rather than actually investigating the memo and reading it, like reading what was in the actual text.
Oh, absolutely. I would love to know how many of the people who had a problem with the memo actually read the memo. I mean, it was just like, when I read it, it was just like very hard for me to believe that this would make anyone feel like they were in a hostile environment. I feel like I've worked in some hostile environments before, and it's not usually like someone posts something on an internal listserv about like, I don't know, the biological differences between males and females. It's just, I don't know. That's not the kind of thing that would make me feel unwelcome at a workplace. And also, like, if these companies do want to increase, the number of women in the fields, they need to figure out the reality here. Like, and if James Damore has a point, and there is this sort of natural cap on the number of women who are going to be interested in this, they need to figure that out and sort of work around it or figure out better ways to recruit or whatever. There's this assumption that women aren't in tech purely because of stereotype threat or something like that, because they've been, you feel like you can't do something because you're told that you can't do something, and therefore you can never get a job at Google or whatever.
Yeah, like I thought his memo sort of downplayed the role. I bet there is. I don't think I'd want to be a woman working like among coders at Google because it's so male dominant. I could see that being shitty, but it was like a very measured sort of Steven Pinker-ish explanation of this stuff, where he was basically like some proportion of this difference could be chalked up to, the fact that men and women have different interests. It just wasn't, I don't know, man, that drove me crazy. And there's also, there's a personality trait called neuroticism that is like the sort of the technical literature term. And at one point, in the course of making another point, he pointed out that women on average have higher neuroticism than men, which it's true. Like that's what the research shows. All these outlets where like the reporters had never read the personality literature were like, oh wow, he's saying that women are neurotic and men aren't neurotic.
Right, like it's a hysteria,
Yeah.
like it's like 1890 or whatever, and like and every complaint that a woman has is chalked up to hysteria or something like that.
Right, and what was interesting was like the outlet Gizmodo that leaked this memo. In some cases they took out links and footnotes. So like Damore himself cited everything. So like where he mentions the neuroticism thing, he cited research, and if you read that version of the memo, you could see. And a lot of context was stripped, and I don't know the story of why. It just felt intentional. It drove me crazy. Anyway, that's my long-winded Damore memo media rant, but it circles me back to this position that, I don't know, like I think conservatives should be allowed to work at Google, and I don't think they're crazy in thinking like there's not a great climate there for them, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure it is as difficult to be a conservative as Google as it is to be a woman at Google. Although there are efforts to make women feel welcome at Google, probably not conservatives. And the thing about the like women in tech, the reason like nobody ever says women are underrepresented in manual labor. Women are underrepresented on road crews. Women are underrepresented in police departments or whatever. Like the reason that it's that I think that it's important that women are underrepresented in tech is because tech happens to be one of the highest paying fields, right? So that's the issue. And so I think that if that's the problem, is the problem that women are more likely to be nurses and social workers and men are more likely to be, or like most of the women I know who work in tech companies are project managers, right? And so, if these positions are less well paid than the coding positions, well, maybe that's what you need to start to address. But the economic pressures are incredibly different when you're talking about something like a publicly owned hospital or or some sort of like social service group or whatever, and the largest, most successful companies in world history. They're just gonna pay better than a public school is, And I don't know what you do about that, other than I guess tax Amazon more and use that money to fund school teachers' positions. But if that's the issue, then that's what we should be talking about, not like diversity for the sake of diversity. Because if diversity is the issue, then why aren't we talking about more women on road crews or more men as nurses?
Right. And yeah, I also just like the idea. It's so when you actually try to unpack that idea of I literally feel threatened coming to work with James Damore because of his memo. Like, imagine if we applied that consistently. So there are evangelical Christians at Google who literally think Jews and Muslims are going to hell. There are Muslims who literally think that according to their faith, that Christians and Jews are going to hell.
Right.
That's okay. That my coworker thinks I'm going to hell. That doesn't threaten me, but a conservative memo does. I just find the I don't know. I'm so torn on the victimhood culture thing because I really do think the right does it a lot too, and I think it's sometimes overstated. But there is a type of 20-something who's the type of person who screams to their employer that you have to train us all to be less racist, and who thinks their employer is going to fix the world, and who thinks there's not going to be any strife or differences in opinion at work. And I had run-ins with those people, and they're very, very unpleasant.
One thing I've been thinking about over the last couple of years is how much should it really matter if somebody has some implicit bias, or they have some deep-seated prejudice. Maybe they think that genuinely think that gay people are going to hell, or maybe they genuinely think that Jews are going to hell or Muslims are going to hell or whatever. Fairly common perspectives to have in the world, all things considered. Does it really matter? If somebody thinks that, I'm a lesbian, if somebody thinks that because I'm
Wait, what?
I'm going. Yes, this is my coming out. Huge news, breaking. So if somebody, thinks that all lesbians are going to hell, or all Democrats, or all whatever, all atheists or whatever, but they don't sort of treat me any differently, should I really care about that? And I'm not sure that I should, and I think there is some value in making the decision for yourself not to care about it. I know that my in-laws, they absolutely 100% think that I'm going to hell. They think that the world was made in 6 days. They think that dinosaurs roamed the earth when man did, and they absolutely think that I'm going to hell. They're still nice to me, Right. I mean, they still my wife's mom made a fucking little blanket for our dog, even though the dog is being raised by 2 mommies. She's totally opposed to it.
Did the blanket say "sorry, you're going to hell" on it?
Yeah, it did. It was just a bunch of fiery crosses on it. But so it's and it took them a while, actually years, to get to the point where they were wanted to meet me. I think it was much more difficult for them to get to know me than for me to get to know them. But they still make an effort, and they think that I'm going to hell, and I don't care. They're still thoroughly decent people who just happen to believe something that I don't.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I wonder. Do these people who want these diversity trainings and who, are opposed to the Damore memo and want people like him fired, do they want total homogeny in the world? And do they want everybody to think exactly what they think? Because I think that'd be pretty boring.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen just from our own travels in journalism that on certain issues, even small differences of opinion are taken to mean you're sort of generating a hostile field that could harm others. And it's never quite explained how that could be the case, but
dude, oh my God. Okay. So a year ago, I'm sure I told you this when it happened. Maybe not even a year ago, maybe 6 months ago, I got called into my publisher's office, And she needed to talk to me because there had been a complaint about me from one of my colleagues. And so I had like tweeted something obnoxious about non-binary identities or something like that. And I have like written thousands of words about like my particular problem with the idea of non-binary. Like it's something that I have actually given lots of thought and consideration to. And I've laid out my arguments about why I think this is problematic and regressive. And so I tweeted something obnoxious about non-binary identities. And my coworker at the time went and complained to the boss. And she said that her community was demanding that she quit her job at the paper, like one of the only fucking like staff writing jobs left in America, over my continued employment at the paper. And the whole thing was just like, it was so ridiculous because it's like my tweet about non-binary identities, like A, like that makes you feel, I don't know, unsafe or just angry or whatever. But B, like The Stranger was a place where, you know, 10 or 15 years ago, if you had a complaint, like if you disagreed with a colleague about something, you would write about it. And that was totally encouraged. And the whole, like Lindy West, the whole reason she has a television show is because she and Dan Savage got in a fight because Dan said something fatphobic. She wrote this blog post about it. It went viral. That became a story on This American Life. It became a book. And then it became a fucking TV show. Right. And that was like, it was great. You know, it's great. Like, you make art out of these conflicts. And then now, you know, in 2019, 2020, the response to some sort of conflict is to literally go complain to HR.
When you told me that story, I just got so mad on your behalf. Like, what? This is like a younger person, right?
Yeah, this is someone who's like a recent college grad. And like, I'll also say, like, I heard stories like this among lots of people in media, a lot of people who like you and I know and read and like have also had very similar scenarios where like younger staffers go like file an HR complaint because they don't like something that somebody has written.
Yeah, there's one story in particular I want to tell, but I think I can't. But maybe like for the $50 a month,
yeah,
we'll tell like the stories that can actually get us in trouble.
Yeah.
I think it's also like when you look at the content of some of the, just going back to the diversity training thing, like there's a controversy in New York where the education chancellor here like instituted this bias training where people were told things that like they were showed a slide. It was like, here are some examples of white supremacist culture, love of the written word. Individualism. And it's like,
oh my God,
that is like actual radical left-wing bullshit. And I'll say that as someone who's pretty far to the left. And so if a conservative complained to me, why are they fucking indoctrinating us instead of just doing like the HR diversity training? I would agree completely. So I think you can't have it both ways. You can't. The NBC story was tellingly short on details of what these trainings entailed other than implicit bias. Mm-hmm. And the best evidence is implicit bias trainings don't work. Mm-hmm. You can't force people to sit through trainings with bizarre bullshit that are clearly an attempt at left-wing indoctrination, even though it's like left-wing indoctrination even most lefties don't believe in, and then complain when conservatives are like, what does this have to do with anything? Why are you trying to turn us into morons? So yeah, maybe like people just need to be clear about what they want out of diversity trainings, but the history of the concept is like, it's never been clear. They're always partly a shield against litigation. There's partly an educational component, partly like a strict HR treat people better component. But I think in 2020, maybe the challenge is like, I'm sure there's still a lot of people being a little bit ignorant and people from minority groups not feeling fully woven into a given office community, but there isn't a lot of like explicit bias or that much racism, like explicit racism left. So maybe these trainings just like don't have as much to do. So they need to get more creative.
Right. You just like find like a more micro and more micro. And the more micro the aggression is, the more training you do to address it.
In White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo, I shit you not, she says that during diversity trainings, white women shouldn't cry because in the past, white women tears have led to the death of black men, like white women accusing black men of rape. So she says, this is a book written in this century, that when white women cry, it makes black people think of torture and murder.
It's like stored in their epigenetics.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes me wonder how many like real life people of color she talks to who aren't fellow diversity trainers.
Right, right. I'm sure this stuff is plenty popular among like the far left of people of color in some corners of the internet. God, I wonder if the average like Black Joe Biden voter in South Carolina, how they would feel about this.
Yeah, I'm skeptical that they would agree that when a white woman starts crying, they think about murder, and it's all just gets very weird. And I don't know. I'm sympathetic to people who think that we should be critical. Again, when I think of these like little 25-year-olds work at Google, which by the way, Google obviously is going to be the reason when the robots kill us because they gain self-consciousness. That's obviously going to be because of Google one way or another. So I feel like you can't work for this big evil company and then get on your moral high horse about how they're not teaching you enough about diversity. It's just something that always bothers me about this like 20-something tech person.
Right. The problem with Google isn't like data collection and mass surveillance. The problem with Google is that they canceled their diversity training.
Exactly. All right. Anything else? We've actually talked a lot about diversity tonight because we recorded the other episode too. Do you have any other? Are you do you hate diversity, Katie? Is that safe to say?
You know what? Well, I like diversity when it comes to this podcast. This is a very diverse podcast with our, a Jew, an honorary Jew, and a non-binary woman.
It's our very own rainbow coalition.
I also have a brown dog. Does that count as diversity?
We're cutting it there. So if you're listening to this, you're one of our I keep wanting to say one of our patrons. We could definitely use feedback on what you want these extra episodes to look like because you're the ones paying for them. So definitely feel free to send us a message via Patreon or email us, blockedandreported@gmail.com.
I'm especially interested in whether or not people want us to do interviews with others from outside of our bubble. So let us know if that's something that interests you.
We should just have James Damore on every week for 15 minutes to talk about the news.
That's it. Just James Damore. He might need a job,
Yeah, we do a segment where every week, whatever the news is, from the right, James Damore, from the left, Robin DeAngelo.
This is going to be a hit.
Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll be back soon.
Okay, cool.